All right, here we are again. All right, so here's where we're going. There is, if you look in Moodle, let me see, and let's find Moodle here. A chapter 10 problem set. Now, if you look at our notes, we had a test on chapters 2 through 5, right? 5 was the end of the first chapter test. Okay, so the first 4 chapters, 2, 3, 4, and 5, were our discussion about international trade. And so that was the first midterm. Now, we need to have a second midterm very soon, which will be based exclusively on 10 and 11. All right. So, towards that end, what we're going to do is on Thursday, we're going to go over the chapter 10 problem set, which I just posted last night. And this one is more, this was an introduction to the balance of payments. So there's not a lot of math or graphs in there. It's a fairly simple and straightforward chapter. So more definitional than anything else. So we'll do that. And then in the meantime, I'll post a problem set for chapters 11, and there will be a sample midterm number 2. And we can start working next week, at which time we can then do the second midterm. Okay. And then the final, now I'm going to make a small change to the final. Originally, I wanted to do 12, 13, 14, and 15, but I think that there's just not enough time for that. So instead, what we're going to do is
That many.
not do chapter 14
I
at all.
don't. I have that many credits in programming, so I guess it's the wrong.
All right. Anyway, we're not going to do chapter 14 at all. We're going to skip ahead. We're done with 13. We're just going to skip ahead to 15. That will be the end of the course. All right. So, that being the case, if the second midterm is chapters 10 and 11, then the final must be chapters 12, 13, and 15, right? Yes, that's okay. So, anyway, so that's where we're going. So, today we'll start 15, and we'll also have some great videos to watch. Chapter 15 is a little different because it's more taking a big picture look at the history of the international financial system. And of course, we can only touch on so many different topics, but we're going to try to cover the most interesting ones, especially the creation of the euro, which, of course, the euro hasn't been around all that long. It was actually started circulating in January 1999. And it was the first time that we've ever had such a large monetary union in history. And so far, it's worked out pretty well, but it does, of course, have a lot of problems too. We'll be covering that among many other um, examples of the international monetary system. And so I think you'll find them to be very interesting. So for today, we'll just focus on chapter 15. And then going forward, like I said, on Thursday, we'll go through the chapter 10 problem set. And then on the following Monday, we can have the chapter 11 problem set, which I haven't posted yet, but I will very soon, as well as the second sample midterm. So for the next couple of weeks, we'll be rotating back and forth between reviewing for the final or actually first for the second midterm and then for the final and the actual notes. Now, the actual last day of the class, that's a few weeks ahead. I mean, we're not, let's see, where are we? I think the last official Monday, we're going to have a Monday off in a few weeks. Monday the 3rd, apparently there's no class. That's not next Monday, but the Monday after that. So there will be a day off mixed in there somewhere. But all right, but like I said, for now, why don't we just focus on chapter 15 and we'll take it from there. All right, so remember, no 14, it's out. We're just jumping straight ahead to 15. And today we'll have the opportunity to look at some videos which are accompany the material that we'll be covering. All right, so let's get this open. All right, so, oh, one more thing. Let me look at, oh boy. All right, so you know what? It looks like I haven't posted this. I'll take care of that right now. This is just the first part, by the way. Oh, hold on. Okay, so this is the first half of chapter 15 that we'll be looking at today. There it is. Okay, great. All right, so we'll start with this. And then, like I said, there are several videos that I'd like us to see today involving the history of the international financial system. And maybe you'll be familiar with them, maybe you won't. But either way, you'll come out with a very intense knowledge of what kinds of exchange rate systems have been tried in the past and how they have successful have they been. So let's begin with the notes. And we start out by noting that we'll be looking at the international monetary system and how it has evolved at the very least since the 19th century. That's when things really started getting interesting. Prior to that, pretty much exchange rate systems didn't change very much. As a matter of fact, and we've already discussed this, the gold standard was in effect for many centuries, but officially all the countries in Western Europe and the United States joined together and got onto the gold standard, what we initially or finally decided to call the gold standard in the 1870s. And that lasted until the outbreak of World War I, when each country defined its currency in terms of gold. So because of that, exchange rates were automatically fixed to each other. We did not have flexible exchange rates. Any country who was on the gold standard automatically had fixed exchange rates with respect to any other country that was on the gold standard. And here's an example. Prior to World War I, the dollar was defined at a rate of $20.67 per ounce of gold. It's hard to believe that now, since gold is selling for something, what, $1,500 an ounce? Let's go check that out real fast. It's a lot of money. Okay, let's see, where is it? Okay, around, yeah, it's almost $1,800 an ounce. So 2067, even allowing for inflation, that's a big difference. Now, the British pound at the same time was defined at 4.2474 pounds per ounce of gold. So because of that, if you combine these two quotes, if you take the dollar quote and the pound quote and divide one by the other, you'll see the ounces cancel out, and we're left with approximately $4.86.65 per pound. And so this is how exchange rates were determined, at least between countries that had the gold standard. Okay, so let's see if we can write this out a little more clearly. I just want to write it like this, so maybe it's easier for you to see what's going on. So when you write it like this, algebraically, this is the equivalent of multiplying by the inverse of this denominator. So the ounces cancel out, and we're left with dollars per pound. So this is how exchange rates were quoted while the gold standard was in effect. Now, not every country in the world, of course, was on the gold standard. And for them, exchange rates were determined in the marketplace. But for the countries using the gold standard, the central bank of that country defined gold, its own currency in terms of gold, so that it was easy to figure out how much of one currency was needed to buy the other currency. And so there was no exchange rate risk, which is kind of nice. They don't like it. Now, of course, in a system like this, each country's gold money supply is tied to its gold holdings. So in other words, the awkward part about this is that the money supply can't change unless you discover more gold, okay, or acquire it somehow. Now, that might not have been such a big problem for some countries. The US has some gold. I mean, you may know that there's a lot of gold in Alaska, for example. But for a lot of countries, they don't have any gold. So gold itself pretty much ties the money supply to a fixed amount. And so the central bank can't realistically engage in monetary policy the way it does now to either increase or decrease the money supply to regulate the economy. So that was one of the awkward things. But on the other hand, when you have a fixed fixed money supply like this, that makes it very difficult to have a high rate of inflation. You can't, if the gold itself is not increasing, then the value of the gold can't change. And therefore, you cannot have inflation in a country that has a fixed money supply. So that was one of the good things about the gold standard, very low inflation rates. Okay, that in fact, people who think we should go back to the gold standard, that's one of the main reasons why they say we should go back, because the inflation is so low with a gold standard. Now, the interesting part is that the balance of payments, deficits and surpluses were therefore automatically corrected through gold inflows and outflows from the deficit countries to the surplus countries. So in other words, imagine that, let's say the US has a deficit with respect to England. US owes $100 million, let's say, to the UK. The British could insist on being paid in gold, in which case $100,000 worth of gold would flow out of the country to the UK. And because of that, the deficit takes care of itself automatically. The gold flows out, the debt is settled, we're back to a balanced current account. And it goes both ways. The British, which have a surplus, no longer have a surplus because they've been paid for the deficit with gold. So in a case like this, gold is taking care of all these international deficits. And it happens automatically. I mean, it's possible that the British wouldn't insist on receiving gold, but because we're on the gold standard, it's probably the case that they would expect to be paid in gold fairly quickly. And so otherwise the gold standard falls apart if the countries involved do not honor their commitments to each other. All right, well, anyway, so what that means then is that if your country has a surplus, gold is flowing into your country, your currency is getting stronger, your exports are becoming more expensive, and your imports are becoming cheaper. So therefore, that surplus will disappear fairly quickly because the strengthening of your own currency will cause your exports to become less attractive. And before you know it, you suddenly find yourself with less exports, more imports, and eventually that means that your current account balance will fall back to zero. And then at the same time, though, with the deficit countries, their currencies are weakening, which makes their exports more attractive and imports less attractive. And so their deficit tends to disappear as well. So in other words, this is all happening automatically. You don't have a situation where a country like the US can have a deficit year in and year out. It doesn't work that way. If we do, we just keep losing our gold. And so eventually we could run out of gold, and then this whole system collapses. So one of the advantages of this system is that deficits, current account deficits, would take care of themselves automatically. Okay, now, of course, again, as I said before, with the gold standard, you have low inflation rates, you have stable prices, and of course, stable exchange rates, because again, if all the currencies are tied to gold and the supply of gold isn't changing very often, then prices and exchange rates can't change either. So you've got very stable prices and you have very stable exchange rates. But this also means that you can't realistically carry out an independent monetary policy, which involves, of course, changing the quantity of money in circulation to affect interest rates and in turn affect the economy. So here we can't really do that because we don't really have any control over our own money supply, because it's uniquely determined by the amount of gold that we have. That's a problem. Okay, every time the country goes into a recession, for example, the central bank cannot lower interest rates to try to stimulate the economy. Or if inflation is getting out of hand, well, although it probably wouldn't here, but if it did, the central bank can't raise rates to slow down the rate of inflation. So that was the main drawback. Now, during this period, there were a lot of financial crises in the US and the rest of the world. The Panic of 1907, which maybe we'll find a video about that later on, was the last disaster that led the country to realize that, you know what, maybe we should have a central bank. Now, here's the weird part about all this. The US did not have any central bank for about 75 years. Okay, now how is this possible? Well, let's just take a quick detour here. And I just want to mention that in the early days of the United States, Alexander Hamilton was a strong proponent. Now, we all know him from that play, of course, but he was the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. He strongly favored having a central bank. Okay, at the time, the U.S., when the U.S. won its independence, it was a relatively small country, not very powerful financially or militarily. And so Hamilton thought the best way to become a major world power, among other things, was to have a central bank. He eventually persuaded Congress to authorize a central bank, which was called the First Bank of the United States. It was given a charter that lasted from 1791 to 1811. It was an experiment. So the Congress didn't want to create a permanent central bank. They wanted to try out and see what would happen if there was a central bank. So this central bank wasn't very similar to what the Fed does now, because it was a private bank that held the deposits of the federal government. So it made loans to private businesses and private individuals. It held money from individual savers, but it also held all of the deposits of funds from the federal government, and it also acted as its agent. In other words, it paid their bills. So it was kind of a mixture of a private and a central bank all in one. And after the 20 years were up, Hamilton had already died by then, and for whatever reason, Congress decided not to renew the charter. So, well, that was pretty unclear. Well, it was, let's just say, awkward for this bank to suddenly disappear. So a few years later, Congress authorized another central bank. In 1816, Congress authorized the creation of another central bank, which was called, you could probably guess, the Second Bank of the United States. Its charter lasted from 1816 to 1836. At the end of those 20 years, the charter was not renewed due to strong opposition from President Andrew Jackson. The charter was not renewed. And so all of a sudden, once again, there's no central bank. And that was very unfortunate timing, because in the spring of 1837, well, the country went into a major recession, and there was no central bank to do anything about it. There was no central bank that could increase the size of the money supply or anything along those lines to help bring the country out of the recession. So there was no central bank from 1836 to 1912. The Federal Reserve System began in 1913. Okay, so we have this long period, 76 years actually, where there's no central bank. Well, that was pretty chaotic. And during much of that time, we were on the gold standard, which helped keep prices low, but it also meant that when things got tough, there was likely to be recessions and even depressions, and there was no central bank to really do anything about it. And in fact, of course, the Civil War certainly didn't help matters. That certainly was very destructive to the country and to the economy. And what's even more interesting is that during the 19th century, individual states and even individual banks were able to issue their own currency. So imagine yourself walking around and shopping in let's say 1850, and your pocket is full of dollars issued by the state of Kentucky, the state of Tennessee, the state of New York, and banks like the Bank of New York, for example, and they all circulated side by side throughout this period. And so you can imagine the economy was pretty chaotic during the last half of the 19th century. In fact, if we look around, we might be able to find a picture. Let's see if we can find one. Okay, no, I don't think they understood what I wanted. All right, I think I got what I was looking for. This is a picture of a dollar bill issued by Stonington Bank, which is in Connecticut. This is a $1 bill issued by the Bank of Stonington, which is a small bank in Connecticut, and it's circulated side by side with all the other paper money in the economy, as well as the coins. So the problem now becomes, well, how do you know how much these notes are actually worth? Are they all worth the same? Well, of course not. Some of them are safer than others. So you could take a Stonington dollar into a store in North Carolina, and they might offer to give you, let's say, 90 cents on the dollar for your dollar bills issued by the Bank of Stonington. So there had to be a system of exchange rates between all these notes that were circulating in the United States so that everybody knew what they were worth. So let's just say it was chaotic. And so along comes the Panic of 1907, which was a major financial crisis. And all of a sudden, it becomes clear that maybe it's time to have another central bank. That's what led to the creation of the Fed. 1913. So most countries have had a central bank for quite a long time. In fact, the Bank of England was founded in 1694, just as a point of comparison. But the US has had a much more mixed history with central banks, to say the least. Anyway, so with all that being said, the gold standard realistically was destroyed by the World War I. I mean, once World War I was over, most of Europe was basically destroyed. And so they had to buy a lot of goods and services to rebuild themselves from the United States. And the US began to accumulate enormous quantities of dollars, not dollars, gold. And before you knew it, eventually got to the point where the US essentially owned almost all of the world's gold supply. And so that would have made it very difficult for other countries to continue on the gold standard because they really didn't have enough gold to keep it going. And then, of course, we had the Depression, and then we had World War II. So in 1933, the US completely went off the gold standard. It not only did not circulate as money, but for a while there, it was actually illegal for American citizens to own gold, except for coins and jewelry. In other words, you couldn't own gold bars. They wanted to take it all out of circulation to make sure that people were using paper money. And so the point of it is that the gold standard couldn't work under the circumstances. And what they wanted to do is switch over to paper money, which we'd had ever since. And gold was also devalued from 20.67 per ounce to $35 an ounce. And even then, that rate was only used for transactions between central banks. Now, interestingly enough, I don't know if I've ever shown this to you before, but how did this happen? How did central banks make transactions with each other? Well, the vast majority of the world's gold was kept in one location in New York City. Where do you suppose that was? Well, here we go. The Fed. That's right, the Fed. So we have the gold vaults in the New York Fed where most of the world's gold is being stored. Which, under normal circumstances, maybe we could have arranged a little class trip down there, but not under these circumstances. So anyway, here's a typical case. Look at that stack of gold going all the way up to the ceiling. So this is where most of it is kept in the New York Fed. It's very secure, and the gold is sitting there. And when we were still in the gold standard, you see each country has its own locker where they keep their gold. And so what would happen is, instead of physically shipping gold back and forth between the two different countries, what they could do is just call up the Fed and say, listen, move some gold from my locker to the other country's locker. So France could call them up and say, please move some of our gold into England's locker to pay for these transactions that we've made. So having all the gold in the New York Fed actually made the gold standard a lot easier to manage. Now, of course, once we went off the gold standard, there was no longer any need for that. But the gold is still sitting there to this day because it's safe. And the countries that own it don't really need it. They know that it's there. They can have it back if they want it, but they usually don't. So it's probably going to stay there forever because nobody really needs it. All right, now, in 1944, as World War II started to wind down, the Allies began to realize that, the war is almost over. Maybe we should start thinking about rebuilding Western Europe. And one way we can do that is to establish a new exchange rate system, which is based on gold and the dollar. So they were not proposing to return to the gold standard because the US owned almost all the world's gold anyway. What they were proposing was a system where the dollar's value would be tied to gold, and then all the other countries' currencies would be tied to the dollar. Okay, so this agreement came to be known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. What happened was, now Bretton Woods is a small town in New Hampshire where there's an enormous hotel where the Allied powers got together and they had all these meetings in which they agreed to create this Bretton Woods Agreement. So it's called Bretton Woods after the town where it was created. And so what they agreed to do is tie their currencies to the dollar, and then the dollar would be tied to gold at a rate of $35 an ounce. So trade deficits could be automatically corrected by gold flows, like under the gold standard. But in addition, these currencies were fixed to each other by how many dollars they were worth. And so each central bank had to agree to do whatever it took to maintain the fixed exchange rate between the dollar and their own currency. Specifically, if their currency got too weak, then the countries had to buy gold. If their currencies got too strong, they had to agree to sell gold. And that way, keep their exchange rates fixed to the dollar at the agreed upon rates. Okay, so while this is not a gold standard, because individuals are not using gold as money, it's called instead a gold exchange standard. And also at this time, now, so if the US had a trade deficit with another country, they could still insist on being paid in gold. Okay, that part of it was maintained. The feeling was that the US has plenty of gold. If they run up any deficits with the rest of the world, they can certainly feel free to pay for it with some of their gold. Now, at the same time, though, the International Monetary Fund was established to help countries, rebuilding countries with balance of payments difficulties. They mainly lent them money as they needed it. And the World Bank was also established to help provide funds to economies that were rebuilding after World War II. Now, the system, as you know, obviously the system is not in place today. It lasted for less than 30 years. All right. After a while, it became clear that it wasn't really needed any longer as these countries did rebuild themselves. And eventually the system was abandoned in the early 70s, partially because the US kept running up enormous current account deficits and inflation got out of hand in the 70s. So eventually the system collapsed and that was the end of it. Okay. It worked, it did what it had to do. It lasted for about 30 years, but at some point it became unnecessary. And so the whole thing was abandoned. What happened after that is that all these countries went to floating or flexible exchange rates. Okay, so all the currencies were floating freely, meaning that they were being determined by supply and demand in those markets. All right. And part of the reason why the system broke down is because the US eventually did start to run out of gold, thanks to all these trade deficits. And eventually, for fear that the US would run out of gold, the system was stopped by President Nixon in 1971. All right. And then they devalued the dollar again, believe it or not, $35 to $38. And then in 73, from 38 to 42.22. Yeah. But that was in the 70s. Okay. So, in the wake of the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement, there are many different currency exchange rate regimes, as they're called, or systems that are in effect throughout the world. So what we're going to want to do, as you know, throughout the chapter, is go through each of these systems one by one and take a look at some of their advantages and disadvantages. Okay, but before we do that, I've got a couple of videos about the Bretton Woods system that I'd like us to see. One of them is very quick. It's just a very brief introduction, and then that's followed by a more a longer one that explains it in more detail. So we'll start by looking at the very quick introduction to the Bretton Woods system. So let's take a look at that. All right, let's check this. Oh, wait, I sent it to the wrong place. Sorry. Here we go. All right, let's look at our introduction to the Bretton Woods system. And believe me, it's short. After World War II, it was clear the world needed a new financial system. The gold standard was considered just Boy, that was fast. All right, but that was a very good, brief, but very good introduction to the subject. But now we've got one here that's a little bit longer. We'll explain it in a little more detail. What exactly was going on during the Bretton Woods system? All right, hold on one second. All right, let's check this out. right, so all right, so we'll just get back to the notes for a few minutes. I have a few more videos that I want us to watch about what comes up next. Now, I did mention that after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, many other different types of exchange rate regimes started being used throughout the world. And so the IMF officially classifies all the different exchange rate regimes or systems into the following categories. So we're going to look at not every single one of these separately, but we'll try to cover many of them as we go along. And the first one is called exchange rate arrangements with no separate legal tender. So we'll see what that one means in a few minutes. Currency boards, other fixed peg exchange arrangements. And of course, pegged arrangements simply means that they can be adjusted periodically. We can have pegged exchange rates within horizontal bands, which puts limits on how much they can move. Crawling pegs, we'll definitely be looking at that one. Exchange rates within crawling pegs. Managed float simply means exchange rates are mainly determined in free markets, but with potentially occasional intervention by central banks. And then finally, independent float means completely and independent of any other considerations. In other words, the exchange rate is completely determined in free markets and the central bank does not intervene. Now, the first one that we really want to look at here is this first one called exchange rate or exchange arrangements with no separate legal tender. Now, this can happen in a couple of ways. You can have either a country using the currency of another country, or it shares a common currency through membership in a monetary union, the way that the members of the Eurozone use the euro as their common currency. But it's this first one that we want to look at more carefully right now. A country uses the currency of another country. How is this possible? Well, for example, Ecuador got rid of its own currency in 2000 and replaced it with the US dollar. El Salvador did the same thing. This is, by the way, known as dollarization. When a country abandons its own currency in favor of using the US dollar, we call that dollarization. And so we've seen it in Ecuador since 2000. El Salvador has had this since 2001 and Panama since 1904, which is going back quite a ways. Now, what's interesting about this system is that you only have, as Ecuador, for example, you can only have a fixed quantity of dollars in your in circulation. You cannot increase or decrease the quantity of dollars, just like with the gold standard. The only way you can acquire more dollars is with exports to the United States. Okay, so exports are one way to acquire more dollars, but basically, for all practical purposes, the money supply is tied to the fixed quantity of dollars that you hold at a given time. So dollarization has some good things and bad things, but one of the bad things is that just like with the gold standard, the central bank cannot realistically conduct its own independent monetary policy. Okay, and yes, so this process is known as dollarization. But on the good side, it can bring price stability and lower interest rates to a country. In other words, Ecuador's interest rate and inflation rates were very high when they decided to go with dollarization. And as a result of dollarizing, their interest rates and inflation rates are much, much closer to those of the United States. And that's what they're getting. In other words, you get rid of all the uncertainty and you reduce your inflation rate and your interest rates down to levels that are consistent with those in the United States. Now, of course, as I said, it also means you're losing your ability to conduct an independent monetary policy. Also, what can happen is that if the dollar gets very strong, that can make Ecuador's exports extremely uncompetitive in world markets. And so that can cause problems within the country because they obviously depend very heavily on exports for their, their GDP. A lot of it comes from trade. So therefore, from their perspective, if the dollar is too strong, that can be a real problem. And there's not a whole lot they can do about it. But having said that, they do, I mean, the benefit is that they did significantly reduce their interest rates and their inflation rates, which were very, very high. So now what I'd like you to see is I've got a couple of videos here about the dollarization in Ecuador and also in Venezuela, where the economy is completely collapsing and people are resorting to using dollars instead of their own currency. So we want to understand how and why this is happening. So let's take a look at this first video is about dollarization in Ecuador. How did it happen and what does it involve? Let's check this out. All right, there it is. All right, so that was a little uneven, I guess, in quality, but still, it got across a lot of important information. Now, this next one is actually an interview. The president of Ecuador, oops, the president of Ecuador was interviewed on TV on the 20th anniversary of dollarization. So that's what this video is all about. So he's going to talk about all the problems that he had trying to get this thing implemented and what happened as a result. And all right, well, anyway, let me show this to you right now. All right, so I've got one more here about dollarization. This one involves not Ecuador, but Venezuela. It's a little bit different though, because in Venezuela, it wasn't an official policy decision. Instead, what's happening is that people are using dollars instead of the local currency because the inflation rate is so completely out of control that Venezuela's currency is essentially worthless. So in this case, the people took it on themselves to, in effect, dollarize the economy. So let's check this one out. All right. So I do have one more here that we should look at today. It's not to do with dollarization. It's just called Why is the dollar so powerful? If you notice, the one common theme of everything we've done so far is that the dollar is a very, very strong currency. So they're asking the question, why is that? So I think that's an interesting question. So we'll check this out too.
about the stability of the US dollar. In 1971, US President Richard Nixon struck
Well, I thought that was especially interesting. Yeah, I mean, in the last several decades, there have been many times when people said, you know, eventually the Japanese yen will become the world's biggest currency. And some of them said, oh, it'll be the euro. And some people thought it would be the Chinese currency. But so far, the US dollar is hanging in there as the number one currency in the world, or as it's often called, the world's reserve currency, which many countries hold dollars. In fact, more than 50% of all US paper money circulates outside the United States, partially because of dollarization and partially because people trust it. So it's kind of interesting how the dollar is the top currency in the world. And of course, that wasn't always the case up until about World War One. It was the British pound. It was really World War One that put an end to that. And since then, the dollar has really been considered to be the number one currency in the world. And of course, as they mentioned in the video, it doesn't seem likely that that's going to change anytime soon. Well, anyway, so I guess that'll have to be enough for today. Now, don't forget, we want to go over the chapter 10 problem set on Thursday. And then the following week, we'll look at the chapter 11 problem set as well as the sample midterm. And in the meantime, of course, we'll continue to cover chapter 15. And at some point fairly soon, we'll start reviewing for the final exam, which is hard to believe it's coming up fairly soon, but it's absolutely true. So in the meantime, unless there's any last minute questions, I'll see you all on Thursday.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay. All right. See you next time.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
When do we have a date for the second midterm?
No, not yet.
Oh,
It'll
not
be-
yet. Okay.
Not yet. No, it'll be very soon though. Probably late, probably sometime next week. Or early.
Next week, that'll be due, or that it'll get distributed.
It'll get sent out. It won't be due to not this week till the following week, most likely.
Okay.
Late next week, like
And
in the late 20s, let's say.
all right. And I believe the first midterm is due this Thursday, correct?
That sounds right. I'm pretty sure that's what I said. Yeah, I'll look it up. Hold on one second. Oh, no, I guess it was maybe not, but I think maybe no, it was out there on the 8th. I think it was meant to be due on the 15th. Or now let's see, maybe it was a little late. Maybe it was tomorrow. I think there was a delay of some kind. So I think it was meant to be due tomorrow, Tuesday by midnight.
Okay.
Is yours done?
Pretty much, yeah. I have the last section to go over.
All right. I'm pretty sure I remember giving everybody an extra day. So tomorrow night at midnight is fine.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
I also had issues submitting it, but if it's due Tuesday at midnight, then it's fine because I sent it to you like a few days ago.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm still gathering them up. Yeah, I'm having, there's always some people who, for whatever reason, they try to send it to me and it gets kicked back and it doesn't work because attachments sometimes cause problems for emails. So if it won't work on my purchase account, try my, Dr. AA account. And if that still doesn't work, I don't know what to do then, but it does happen. It's not that unusual because I guess the documents can be very large when you're using photographs. And so that can be a real issue, especially with the purchase account. It has a limited amount of memory, I guess. So if you can't get it over here, just try my personal account. And then if that still doesn't work, just send me an email and we have to figure out something else.
Okay. Yeah, I sent it to the Dr. AA account.
Okay. All right. So
Thank you.
soon enough, I'll gather them all up and let everyone know if there was a problem receiving them.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
See ya.
All right. Anyone else? All right. See you all next time.